Facebook. Hello, future people. So our first segment, we won't make this long. But looking at the art of worship leading, basically what's in my heart is the first couple. Just we'll talk about it a bit. I know it's a little bit of talking, but I think it's cool right at the beginning just to sort of lay some foundations. Tonight I just want to talk about what does it mean to lead worship? Like, what are we actually doing? And hello, God. What my heart is to maybe do that for a couple of segments. We'll just do a bit of foundations. But then the concept in my heart is building our worship leaders tool belt, and basically each session picking a specific tool or skill which would be useful to have as a worship leader. And so I'm thinking of skills like, what do you do when the congregation is disengaged? You know, how do you lead? How to lead worship specifically with your vocal? How to lead the musicians effectively? And I was writing down yesterday, and there's like a whole stack I could think of. So I'd love the goal will be basically each touch point we pick a skill, pick a tool out of the tool belt, and say we're just gonna have a crack at this tool for 20 minutes or whatever, and workshop that. But first, I wanted to start with laying a couple of foundations. What is worship leading? I know it's a big question. It's really foundational. I think it's really important for us just to begin just by briefly saying, what are we actually doing? Because that will obviously, everything we do should apply to that. And so if we have different ideas about that, if we think it means singing the lead vocal and getting everyone to sign autographs afterwards or something, it's not going to work. So normally I would say, I'd throw that question out and say, let's break into smaller groups like 2s and 3s and discuss it and then bring back your answers. But seeing as we're only a really small group anyway, maybe we'll just bypass that step. I know it doesn't give you much thinking time. But do you guys want to just throw out some thoughts quickly? And then I can sort of give a few thoughts and a few biblical things.
Signing autographs and
signing autographs. Yeah. Autographs. Make sure we get that out there.
And taking pictures.
Yeah. I need to get the pictures. Selfies. Yeah. Social media posts. Yeah. Social.
profile pictures.
Yeah. We'll just put all that under social. So that sounds good. Cool. Anything else? Partially more spiritual?
That's about it.
Singing the lead vocal. We didn't put that.
Making sure you're the loudest.
Both.
In everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, visually and
And you're standing in front of everyone. Understand?
you have brightest lights.
Yeah.
Competing for stage time with the pastor.
I think you guys have got it nailed. This is good. Any other slightly more serious thoughts of what it means to actually be the worship leader?
So like leading the other vocalists and musicians to help create an environment for the congregation to meet with God, I guess.
Yeah. So vocalists, so leading vocalists and musos, and then and you said creating an environment.
Yeah.
Encounter God. A really good element of it.
This one might not be correct, but I'm curious on our collective and your perspective of it. Or no. Putting the worship needs of the congregation ahead of your own.
Yeah. So what if I'm just gonna say we've got leading vocalist musos, I'm gonna say congregation. I think that's a really good point. I know we're sort of jumping ahead a bit because we are all people who have a decent understanding of it. A really important, I think, thing about worship leading is it's not just your worship time. If you come away from worship leading and say, God, I just poured out my heart to you. I gave you everything. It was a beautiful, sweet sound to you because I just worshipped you and adored you and loved you. That actually may not be a tick as a worship leader because you're leading the congregation. And so if you didn't lead the people to a place where everyone had the opportunity to do that too, you actually haven't done your role as the worship leader. You've done your role as a worshiper, which is nice. I was talking to Dad about this stuff yesterday. He was like, he remembers someone saying, he doesn't remember who it was, the concept that yeah, sometimes let's say your worship leader, you might need to have your worship time on Friday morning or whatever, because Sunday morning might not necessarily be that's not your time where it's just me and God and I just pour out my heart to him, because you're actually fulfilling an important role leading the people into that place, if that makes sense. So I would say, from that perspective, I would agree. It's actually about putting the congregation's worship needs ahead of you. Now, you're part of the congregation. We're a community. It's not like you're just a robot who doesn't matter anymore. But yeah, does that make sense? That sort of distinction. Any other sort of thoughts? What's it means to lead worship?
Yeah. So something that comes to my mind is it's more than just a good performance or like being technically perfect. It's sort of following the Holy Spirit and transporting everybody. You know, obviously the other band members and the congregation have a role to play in this, but you know, basically transporting people into an encounter with God, or into sort of total focus on God. Not just sort of singing songs,
Totally
being technically sort of perfect.
I think that's really good. Whenever I say leading people into God's presence, it's sort of, I don't know exactly how to put it into words, sort of the concept you're saying, but I agree into that encounter. I think so leading people in that place where there's an encounter, they're in God's presence, they're in his glory. You sort of got these over here. We'll just make sure everyone knows that's the first one.
It's X for like really denoting them. This is like X marks the spot. Yeah.
We've got practical elements, so things like the music, the technical skills or whatever, which are really just facilitating that stuff. So it's like, if we say, worship leading is, the technical skills and the elements of it, singing and music and stuff, those are really just practical elements that facilitate the real heart of what we're doing. There's still important skills to have because they're the skills that enable it, but that's not the essence of what we're doing. What we're doing is leading people into a place of God's presence, encountering glory, and creating an environment where we do that, leading everyone, the vocalists, the musicians, the congregation, all into that place. There's actually a concept, and a lot of this stuff is big concepts, and I'm not going to pretend that I've got like it all perfectly mapped out in my head and dot points or whatever. But you see in the Old Testament, there was basically there was 3 roles that would represent God: the prophet, the priest, and the king. And the priests, a key part of their priestly duties was actually worship leading. And I was listening and looking at some Bible Project stuff about this concept. And there was a really good video where it only talks about it briefly, but I'll link it to you guys after this, where it talks about the role of the priests. And they would basically be, I can't remember the exact wording, but basically saying the priests were like the go-between heaven and earth, effectively. They would represent the people to heaven, they'd offer sacrifices, offer up the worship, but then they'd also represent heaven to earth. And through their worship, often you see multiple times in the Old Testament, it talks about how they would bring out songs, and then heaven would invade earth. You see in I think 2 Chronicles 5, when they dedicated the temple, the priests came and started to lead worship, and the presence of God came, and everyone was just lost in worship. You see multiple times where it talks about God's presence coming, and it talks about how they would go up before and they'd blow the shofar. Jericho, they specifically go and blow the shofar. That was the priest, that was actually the worship leaders effectively out the front making that noise, and then when the people joined behind, they saw God's judgment come. So it's almost like the priests, the worship leaders were this sort of ones between heaven and earth. So it's like lifting up our worship, and on behalf of the people, bringing our worship to heaven, but then also through what they're doing, bringing heaven into Earth's atmosphere. Does that make sense? That concept? And so that's sort of what I see for us as worship leaders. we weren't born into the tribe of Levi, but it says really clearly in Hebrews that we're now a kingdom of priests. It actually specifically says that as New Testament Christians, through what Jesus did, we're all priests. So we actually all have this this ability and this mandate to be like the go between heaven and earth. That's a lot of what Dad's been preaching in the deserts garden sort of concept. But us specifically as worship leaders, I think, and all this stuff is saying exactly the same thing. It's sort of like bringing people to a place where we lead the people to present our worship as a sacrifice unto God, and to connect sort of to lead earth to touch heaven, and to lead heaven to touch earth, if that makes sense. That we create an atmosphere where it becomes heaven on earth. Does that make sense? That's sort of it's big concepts, obviously, and I really think that's the pattern you see through the Bible. And I think in my heart that's I feel like that's what God's calling us to do as worship leaders. There's a well, sorry, any other thoughts? Anything else you want to? It doesn't have to be an extensive list, but any other thoughts specifically you want to add to that?
And then that function is like set like this, and then you can click the top, and
Because it's not obviously not the only thing. This is probably in between the practical and the high level you've got there. But like, obviously on our own we're doing stuff. We're also preparing an atmosphere for whatever the rest of the meeting will entail.
That's
so
really...
it's not the only thing, because I don't want to just become the caretakers or the preparers, but because it's actual power that can happen during it. But I think obviously, especially being the first thing that happens between us, then you got like communion and whatever, and then the preaching.
Yeah.
Obviously we're there as well to prepare and continue on whatever we bring.
Yeah. I'll just put there we're a part of the breakthrough service, that we actually, in what we're doing, we're creating that atmosphere and doing that and leading people into that place of encountering God's glory. As a part of the body, we're obviously in submission to the leadership, obviously working alongside potentially people coming and bringing, and that's something I'd love as skills for us to work with. What do you do as a worship leader when someone comes and gives a prophetic word, which is different to the direction you were going to go, or something like that? But or let's say we're doing this as part of the body, where there's multiple people coming and bringing their parts. It's not just the worship leader show on Sunday. So that's a really important element. That's a genuine part of what we're doing. As worship leaders. I think that's a great list. It's not, we didn't need to come and have this fully extensive, like everything a worship leader is. But I think I feel like gives a good heart that we're in this place to lead. You see multiple times we're leading the people into God's presence and glory. We're leading these different groups, the vocalists, the musicians, the congregation. I'd love us to look at specific skills this year. How do you lead vocalists? How do you lead the musicians? How do you lead the congregation? Because they're all three different groups of people we got to lead. How do you lead the media guys? How do you lead how do you lead the media team? How do you lead online congregation? Well, we're leading, not dragging. We're sort of going and creating an opportunity for that. I think these ones really, it's the heart of it. All these, creating an environment where they encounter God's presence and glory, and it's that place where you touch heaven, where on that, just following forwards from that a bit. I don't know, what do you guys think of the concept where how I say, well, okay, I had a conversation with someone not from this church, nothing to do with anyone here, so don't try and imagine who it is, but they're a worship leader in a totally different setting, and they were saying how at their church they had someone who was new and developing leading worship, and I was like, how did it go? That's really exciting, that's really cool. I was like, it was all right, but they started with worship, not praise. And they're like, and I was like, oh, and they're like, so and there's like, I was like, okay, we need to work through this. They started with worship, not praise. So I'm like, okay, so you're saying they started with a slow song, not a fast song. But I would say and this person's a great I actually think a great worship leader, a great person. I'm not saying it to knock them. But it's a very strong perspective that it's like worship leading. It's like we're leading people on the journey. Through we go from here, we go into praise, and then we go into worship, and then it's like we've done our job. I think all that, the scriptures like in Psalms, I can't remember which Psalm it is, where it says, enter his gates with thanksgiving in your heart, into his courts with praise. So it's like, okay, you start with thanks, praise, and then we go to worship. And even like I was looking, like it says that like that's Hebrew poetry, which is just trying to repeat itself. Like it's not saying it's progression from thanks to praise. It's just saying the same thing twice. But people have built whole like concepts around this. But at the same time, most of our services, we'd start with some fast stuff and then do slow stuff. And praise and worship are different concepts. I'm not against that. In light of this, what do you guys think of this progression? Is it correct? Is it not correct? What does it actually look like for us? What are we aiming for as worship leaders? Does that make sense? If Chris gets up on Sunday and starts with worship instead of praise, we're all going to face palm. It's you perverted, unbelievable generation. Don't know the song on when it comes out with two fast songs.
The first thing that came to my mind would be would just depend on the Holy Spirit. So throw the cookie cutter sort of model out and just follow what the Holy Spirit is leading. So that's a worship song first, and a praise song, or praise and worship, and that's sort of what trumps the sort of like.
Exactly. Yeah,
I would say though, I feel like that obviously other churches do it, but if you don't have anything specific, it's the most generally effective means. If you go fast to slower, potentially finishing with a fast song, because then it sort of helps break on the assumption people don't come in perfectly ready, helps like sort of loosen them up a bit. And it's like maybe soften the hearts, get them in a spot, and then you can move and do, not that you can't do stuff in the praise, but you can move into the worship and then seal it off with praise, or you just stop it there.
Exactly.
So it's like, if you don't have anything specific, I think it's the most effective generic one if you have to decide a song order without anything else.
Totally.
I feel like in a similar vein, it's probably more accessible, especially for newcomers.
Totally.
Like if we just start off with worship, not that there's something wrong with that.
No.
If we're all just like,
the
newcomers like, well, it's a bit weird.
Exactly. And because it's all down to like we're leading people into God's presence. And it's like what Chris said before, this is about leading the people, not about us. You might come in ready just to throw up your hands and sing We Exalt Thee. But the Wong family might have had a pretty hectic morning, and Elliot's been angry in the car, and and gotten here and they've just made it in the church, and they might not be ready to throw up their hands and to sing We Exalt Thee in beautiful surrender. Or people might have come from a really hard week or a really great week. Like it's got to be spirit led. That's actually a really good point, Priya. I'll add the people we're leading. You're gonna have unbelievers there. I'm saying unbelievers, or people who are not Christians. Heathens, yes. Unbelievers. I feel like a couple of things with this. I totally agree with everything you guys have said. We want to be spirit led. There's a reason we often sort of start with fast stuff and then go into slow stuff, because it often sort of works for what we're trying to achieve. This, it's not a bad way of doing it. It works pretty well, but it's not our formula. I reckon it's important to note that praise and worship are not synonyms for fast songs and slow songs. I know you guys know that, but I think it's really important. They're heart attitudes. We can worship God without ever singing. We can praise God without singing. I think we can do both at the same time. I don't think you have to praise for 15 minutes before you're allowed to worship. The Holy Spirit said, stop worshiping, you praise only for 12 minutes. Perverted, unbelieving. And I just wanted to name that a bit, because I want us as a collective of worship leaders to view this more as like I don't know, more as like a soup than like clearly defined cut pieces of something. It's like we're gonna come and we're gonna praise and we're gonna worship and we're gonna it sometimes it'll be fast and rowdy, sometimes it'll be slow and raw, sometimes it'll be both, sometimes it'll be have like military sort of warfare, sometimes it'll be soaring, it'll be all sorts of things, and it's gonna ebb and flow and do all sorts of things. I think the key is that in all of that, we're leading people into God's presence to encounter His glory. I'll finish in just with one last sort of concept. And this really actually marked me. It was a number of years ago. We went to a conference where they were doing a bunch of worship and stuff, and I was there with Dad, and this was a band playing that like do a heap of worship stuff and really great. Like I love their stuff. You know, I'm not in any way saying this to knock them. It's just, you know, stuff that makes me chew and work through what we're doing. And I find it helpful for sort of developing our perspective. And they were basically, they weren't saying this, but it was like, the goal was like, we're just going to get to this worship where we're just like, just worshiping before God, and it's going to be intimate worship. And so it's like everything, and there was like, we did multiple worship things where it was like for, you know, long extended times we get, and it was like worship, and it was like, and they was like, just enjoy worshiping. It's just so fun. We just pour out our hearts and just worship God. It's great. It's great. And it was great. Like I enjoyed it. But I remember Dad saying afterwards, he's like, I wish they would take it one step further and actually say, we're not just leading you to worship. We're leading you. So it's becoming a mess. Phrase he said was to the glory. And the concept he was talking about was like, remember we talked about the priests and the sort of representing earth to heaven, but also then heaven coming into earth. It was like in this great worship conference, it's like all of us coming together from earth, and it's like they're leading us to worship heaven and to bow before God and say, we adore you, you're amazing, that's great, you're wonderful. And that's awesome. I'm not for a second saying there's anything wrong with that. But it's like they didn't know or didn't ever mention or do anything to say, but what we're actually going to do is come to that place and step into God's glory, where then God comes and now He ministers back to us, if that makes sense. He comes and imparts something. Like He comes and plants a seed. He comes and speaks prophetically. And that's the concept of the priests, is that they didn't just come on behalf of the people and say, we worship you, we offer our sacrifices. They also then, it's like this bridge between heaven and earth, where then God was like, all right, now heaven can invade, and heaven can step into earth and can change things. And I think that's a really important distinction, that what we want to do as worship leaders is creating an environment, leading people into that place where we encounter God's presence, where it's not just an awesome time of worshiping God, but where heaven actually invades and it's actually stepping into His glory, where because in God's glory, God can plant seeds in people's heart. God can speak. And I'm not saying this couldn't happen at that conference. I don't mean that. But God can speak prophetically, where it's no longer just us on earth praising God in heaven. It's like the lines are blurred between the two, where they overlap, and it's like what God's doing in heaven, we're now in the heartbeat of that here on earth. Does that make sense? And also not to in any way say that our worship is about us getting something, because that's not if we come to worship and it's about me receiving, that is part of it, because when we encounter God's presence, when heaven and earth combine, that I want God to plant seeds in my heart that change me. I don't want to go out of a worship service the same, but my ultimate goal is to honor Him. You know, it's for the purpose of honoring Him and glorifying Him. And so if we had to, I don't know, if we had to sort of plot a journey for what we're doing, I would sort of see it as this sense where we bring people in and we praise and we worship, but we sort of get into this point of, I don't know, praise and worship. It's like you get into this place of like intimacy with God. But I think it can even be like almost cyclical. It's like we come, we praise and worship, and then God speaks, and then we come, and out of that we praise and worship more, and then God speaks, and it's sort of like this cycle of like, so we worship you even to a greater level, and then God God can impart something even greater, and then we worship you to a greater level. It's like it's perpetuating, it's ongoing. It's not like a journey where we go through our praise and our worship and sweet, we did it. It's like it's a wheel. I think it's in Ezekiel, where he talks about seeing the worship of heaven, and he talks about the wheel within the wheel and the wheel. I'm not saying it's that, but there's something of God that's like that, where it's a constant sort of cycle and growing each time. Does that make sense? Does that sort of give any sense? So all I have to say, as worship leaders, that's what I see our role is to lead all these people in this journey, basically. And so over the next weeks, as we do more of this, we'll start to build that tool belt and develop the skills, chat about ways that we can do. I'm sorry tonight was a lot of talking, so it's cool to lay a foundation. And develop skills of how we can together lead people in this sort of cycle process. So that God's glory. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
It sort of this sort of concept in my mind sort of falls short in a couple of ways. But what I see with the circles is like using that sort of Old Testament priestly motif is like the outer courts, inner courts, and the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
And obviously we're New Testament Christians, so we're all in the Holy of Holies. But
Yeah,
like
that's
in the
good.
context of being a worship leader, we're sort of like the ones going or leading people into the Holy of Holies. But then like the cycle struck me as so powerful because the unbelievers will be in the outer courts. You know what I mean? So it's important for this sort of like, I don't know, in our worship, always be like circling around and like bringing more people in.
That's
as we
really good.
circle around sort of thing.
That's really good.
So, yeah, that's a really good concept.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, and because you're right, as New Testament believers, the Holy of Holies is available to us all, but it doesn't mean when we all come to church, we're all actually living out of the Holy of Holies place. We probably need to come through the outer courts, the inner courts, and into. Do you know what I mean? Even though it's available and it's open, and the sense where we always have Christ in us. I'm not saying he's gone away and yet we have to get him back in like that. But yeah, it's like we still come into that place of intimacy and the Holy of Holies of God's very glory and presence. And actually, then we cycle around, we sort of come in. It's almost like a vortex. Each time it's just a bit higher and a bit higher and a bit higher.
If we just sort of camped in the Holy of Holies, like an unbeliever coming into the service, be like, what is sort of like going on? Where if we're sort of circling around, ebbing and flowing as the Spirit leads, we're sort of like leading more and more people into like the encounter with God and the glory of God.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. We'll leave it there because I know we've got other stuff we want to do. To close that, I'll send you that link to the Bible Project video about the priest. It's really simple. It's really just talking about the role of priest, but it can give just a bit of another voice, that perspective. As you were talking about that, Cam, I also just remembered there's a book that actually really impacted me by Ruth Heflin. I don't know. Do you remember Ruth Heflin?
Yep.
So like
that was, and what's the name that was with her?
Carniel?
Was the one? Yeah, that was the one that played piano with.
Michelle Akers.
Yes.
Yeah. She's like a really old school prophet, moved to Israel, just like actually some phenomenal stories. She prophesied Bob Hawke into office in Australia. She rang my grandpa in the middle of the night, said, I need to come to Australia and prophesy to a man who's going to become prime minister. Can I stay at your house? And he's like, okay. And it, but was legit, she prophesied kings into like all sorts of stuff all around the world. And she wrote, and so she got to know my grandparents, and she wrote a book called Glory, which was just like, I think this concept was like the heartbeat of her life. And it really impacted me. It's honestly, it's not well written. It's not well structured. It's like she's just gotten down to the typewriter and just written stuff. But I actually read it again late last year, and it was like, it's like every time I read it, my spirit just comes alive with this. It's like talking about concepts. It's like I don't even know how to put it into words, but all that to say, I'd love for us as worship leaders to maybe even read that, because it sort of talks about that concept. I doubt it's in print. I'll follow up with Mum. But I think she's got a couple of copies. So as long as you guys are happy to sort of look after it, maybe we could share it around, and actually that could be something we could just read and Oh, sorry, Lord, I'll be done in 1 sec. We might be. I was going to say it could be cool. It's only very small. I think, I read it in less than a day, but
Gotta put more reverb on.
more reverb on, bro. Oh, look. Sorry, Lord. Well, let's say if you guys are open to that, maybe that could be something we could share between us and read just to sort of reinforce that concept. But awesome, thank you, team.
Cool.
That was cool.
Thank
That was
you.
good. Will you stop recording?
Hey,
Oh yeah, we'll stop recording.